What if the outcome of a great war depended not on the number of warriors, but on the cunning of the gods? Shrouded in myth, the Trojan War became an arena for the clash of two opposing forces, the unbridled fury of Ares and the strategic mind of Athena. Now we will immerse ourselves in an epic confrontation where cunning and wisdom outweighed brute force. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. All great fires start with a single spark. For the Trojan War, that spark was a golden apple. This story began not on the battlefield, but at a wedding feast celebrating the union of Peleus, king of Thessaly, and Thetis, a sea nymph. All the gods of Olympus were invited to the celebration, except for one, Eris, goddess of discord. Insulted, she decided to take revenge in the way she knew best, by sowing discord. The fragile silence of the luxurious hall is broken by a light knock. A small golden ball rolls across the marble floor, sparkling in the light of the torches. It stops at the feet of the supreme goddesses. Only one phrase is engraved on its side, "To the most beautiful." Three goddesses instantly claimed their right to this title. Hera, the powerful wife of Zeus, patroness of marriage. Athena, the clear-eyed warrior, goddess of wisdom. And Aphrodite, whose beauty made mortals and gods lose their minds. Zeus, finding himself in a delicate position, choosing one meant incurring the wrath of the other two, acted like a wise but cunning ruler. He shifted the responsibility to a mortal. The choice fell on Paris, son of the Trojan king Priam, who at that time lived as a simple shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida, unaware of his royal origins. Hermes brought the goddesses to the young man, and he was faced with a choice that was beyond his power. It was not just a beauty contest, it was an auction of promises where the fate of the world was at stake. Hera, queen of the gods, offered him what was valued above all else, power. She promised to make him the ruler of all Asia, the most powerful king on earth. Athena, whose spear never missed its mark, and whose shield, the Aegis, reflected all evil, offered him wisdom and military glory. She promised him victory in every battle, and the fame of the greatest commander in history. Aphrodite offered neither power nor glory. Her gift was far more personal and intoxicating. She promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman, Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Paris's choice was not that of a king or a warrior, but of a young man driven by passion. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. At that very moment, the seeds of a future war were sown. Hera and Athena, humiliated and rejected, harbored resentment. Their anger was directed not only at Paris, but at his entire family and his entire city, Troy. From that day on, the fate of the great city was sealed. The Achaeans, setting out on their campaign against Troy, did not yet know that behind them stood two powerful goddesses for whom the destruction of the city had become a matter of personal honor. Thus, a simple dispute over beauty laid the foundation for a 10-year bloodbath in which not only the armies of mortals would clash, but also two opposing philosophies of war. If Athena represented war as a science, Ares was its primitive, untamed chaos. For him, battle was not a means to an end, it was the end itself. He is the god of frenzied rage, bloody slaughter, and deafening battle cries. In the Iliad, Homer paints a portrait of him without any sympathy. Even his father, Zeus, addresses him with contempt. "Of all the gods, you are most hateful to me, Olympian, for you delight only in strife, battles, and wars." On the fields of Troy, Ares was the embodiment of brute force. He did not develop tactics or weave intrigues. He simply burst into the thick of battle, huge, clad in shining copper, and reveled in violence. His presence on the battlefield was like a natural disaster. The warriors he blessed with his protection turned into berserkers, losing their fear and human form, driven only by a thirst for blood. He supported the Trojans largely because his beloved Aphrodite was on their side. His choice was dictated not by strategic calculation, but by personal attachments and a love for the very process of war. Imagine a field littered with bodies. The air is thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of blood. All you can hear is the clang of metal and the death rattles of the dying. And above it all, there is a deafening roar, like the cry of 10,000 warriors. This is Ares. He does not distinguish between the righteous and the guilty. He simply sows death, enjoying every moment. His spear strikes indiscriminately. His shield takes the blows meant for his favorites. Ares is impulse, blind rage that can sweep away everything in its path, but which lacks direction. He is force without vector. His approach to war is a frontal assault, a crushing blow that either brings instant victory or shatters against a well-thought-out defense. This was his main weakness. He was predictable in his fury. His power was immense, but it lacked cunning and foresight, which made him vulnerable to those who preferred to use their minds rather than their muscles. At the other end of the divine pantheon was Athena. If Ares was the god of war and chaos, Athena was the goddess of war and order. She did not patronize battles for the sake of battles, but rather just and defensive wars, those fought to protect cities and restore justice. She was born from the head of Zeus, already in full battle attire, symbolizing the union of unsurpassed wisdom and military might. Her epithets speak for themselves. Promachos, warrior fighting at the front. Polyada, defender of cities. Her participation in the Trojan War was the complete opposite of Ares's actions. She rarely intervened directly in battle, preferring to act through her chosen heroes. Her weapons were not so much a spear and shield as a sharp mind and precise calculation. She was a divine staff officer, the chief strategist of the Achaean army. Her favorites were heroes who combined bravery and intelligence, the cunning Odysseus, whose tricks saved the Greeks more than once, and the valiant Diomedes, capable of daring and calculated maneuvers. Athena did not instill blind fury in her warriors. Instead, she gave them clarity of mind in the heat of battle, suggested the right tactical decisions, deflected enemy attacks, and directed their own. Her help was like the advice of a wise mentor at a critical moment. She could appear as a comrade in arms and encourage a disheartened warrior, or whisper an idea in a commander's ear that would turn the tide of battle. For Athena, war was a complex chess game where every move had to be thought out and every sacrifice justified by the ultimate goal. Her anger at Paris's decision was cold and calculated. She did not seek to simply drown Troy in blood, as Ares would have liked. She sought its complete, unconditional, and methodical destruction, thereby proving the superiority of reason and order over chaos and passion. Thus, even before the first Achaean ship touched Trojan sand, the war was already being fought on two levels: on Earth, where men fought for honor and glory, and on Olympus, where two eternal principles clashed: unbridled fury and cold calculation. The confrontation between these two deities was a clash not only of tactics, but of worldviews. Ares did not come to the battlefield alone. He was accompanied by his sons from Aphrodite, Deimos, terror, and Phobos, fear, as well as Eris, the goddess of discord, the very one who threw the apple at the feast. His entourage was the embodiment of psychological weapons, but crude weapons that appealed to base instincts. They did not cause doubt. They paralyzed the will, turning the bravest warriors into trembling animals. Air's presence on the battlefield changed its very physics. The air became heavier, the cries louder, and the blood seemed to flow thicker. He was a catalyst for cruelty, an amplifier of the chaos that already reigned in the hearts of mortals. In contrast, Athena acted more subtly and selectively. Her hatred for Troy was no less intense than Hera's, but while Hera was prepared to burn the city along with the righteous and the guilty out of pure vengeance, Athena pursued a different goal. For her, the fall of Troy was to be a vivid lesson, a triumph of the Greek spirit that she embodied, the spirit of reason, order, and strategic superiority, metis, cunning. She did not simply want the Achaeans to win. She wanted this victory to be achieved through the qualities she valued most. Therefore, her intervention was always precise and calculated. She did not disperse the enemy phalanxes with divine radiance, but strengthened the spirit of a single hero at the decisive moment. She did not throw lightning bolts, but planted an idea in Odysseus's head that was worth hundreds of lightning bolts. Her war was a war of ideas, and the battlefield at Troy became a giant chessboard on which she proved the futility of her brother's brute force. This clash of principles found its most vivid and literal embodiment in one of the central episodes of the Iliad, in the 5th song, during the so-called Aristia, period of greatest feats, of the hero Diomedes. Diomedes, king of Argos, was one of the most powerful Achaean warriors, second in strength perhaps only to Achilles and Ajax. But he was distinguished not only by his strength, but also by his prudence and deep piety. In the heat of battle, when the Achaeans began to retreat under the onslaught of the Trojans, led by Hector and Ares himself, Diomedes prayed to Athena. And the goddess heard him. She appeared not in thunder and splendor, but as a faithful comrade in arms. She stood on his chariot, taking the reins and whip in her hands. Her presence was imperceptible to others, but for Diomedes it was like a breath of fresh air. The goddess did not simply give him strength, she did something more. She removed the veil from his eyes, allowing him to see the gods fighting among mortals. It was an incredible and dangerous gift. "But remember one thing, son of Tydeus," she told him. "Do not dare to raise your hand against the other Olympians. But if Ares himself appears on the battlefield, strike him with sharp copper without hesitation." This was not just an order. It was a carefully planned operation. Athena did not fight Ares herself. She used a mortal as a tool, like the tip of a spear, guided by her will. Soon they saw him. Ares had just slain an Achaean warrior and was removing his armor. He was huge and terrifying, but Diomedes, guided by the goddess, did not flinch. Athena, invisible to the god of war thanks to Hades' helmet, directed the chariot straight at him. Diomedes lunged forward. His spear, guided by the goddess's hand, struck Ares in his unprotected groin. What happened next shocked both mortals and gods. Ares, invulnerable to ordinary weapons, roared. Homer writes that his cry was like the cry of 9,000 or 10,000 warriors going into battle. It was not a cry of rage, but a cry of pain and humiliation. The god of war, the embodiment of indomitable power, had been wounded by a mortal. Leaving the battlefield, he rushed to Olympus, shrouded in a black cloud, to complain to Zeus about his sister. This moment became a turning point. The Achaeans, who saw the god's flight, were heartened. The Trojans, deprived of their most ferocious protector, faltered. But more importantly, Athena had clearly demonstrated that even the divine power of blind rage was vulnerable to a precise, calculated, and strategically justified strike. She did not simply defeat Ares in a local skirmish, she discredited his very approach to war. But the pinnacle of her strategic genius, where cunning manifested itself in its most cruel and effective form, was the death of Hector. Hector, Priam's eldest son, was not only Troy's greatest warrior, he was its heart and soul. Unlike Ares, he fought not out of a love of violence, but out of love for his city and his family. As long as Hector was alive, Troy was indestructible. Athena understood this better than anyone else. And when Achilles, maddened by grief after the death of Patroclus, challenged Hector to a decisive duel, the goddess knew that this was her chance. The duel did not start well for Achilles. Hector, realizing that he could not defeat Phaethon's son in open combat, resorted to tactics. He ran around the walls of Troy 3 times, exhausting his opponent and dodging his deadly blows. He thought intelligently and cautiously, as befitted a defender of the city. At one point, Zeus even leaned towards saving the noble Trojan, but Athena intervened. She did not give Achilles additional strength. There was no need for that. She struck Hector's most vulnerable spot, his heart. She took the form of his beloved brother, Deiphobus. Just as Hector was about to flee again to find a more advantageous position, Deiphobus appeared before him. He spoke encouragingly to him, promising support. "My brother, do not be afraid. Let us face this fierce Pleiades together. I will be by your side, and together we will repel his attack." For Hector, this was a sign from above. The appearance of his brother at the most difficult moment gave him strength and determination. He believed that the gods were on his side. He stopped and turned to face Achilles, ready to fight. He threw his spear, but it bounced off Achilles' divine shield. Now it was his turn to take the blow. He turned to his brother to take a second spear, and saw no one. Emptiness. In that moment of terrifying silence, Hector understood everything. He had not been betrayed by his brother. He had been deceived by the gods. His spirit was broken even before Achilles' spear pierced his neck. Athena did not simply help kill Hector. She destroyed his faith, his hope, turning him from a hero fighting for his home into a desperate victim of divine treachery. It was not just a victory of cunning over strength, but of cold, ruthless calculation over human nobility. And yet, even after Hector's death, the walls of Troy remained impregnable. 10 years of siege, countless battles, the deaths of the greatest heroes on both sides. Nothing could break the defenders. Brute force, even the force of a warrior like Achilles, was powerless against the stone masonry. The war had reached a stalemate. And it was at this moment that Athena delivered her final decisive blow, which became the quintessence of her philosophy. The idea came to her favorite Odysseus. It was a plan so daring, so unthinkable, that it could only have been conceived in a mind blessed by the goddess of cunning. Build a giant wooden horse, dedicate it to Athena as a sign of reconciliation, and hide a select group of warriors inside. The rest of the army would stage a retreat, burn the camp, and sail away, hiding behind the nearest island of Tenedos. This plan was a masterpiece not so much of military warfare as of psychological warfare. It struck several vulnerable points of the Trojans at once. Firstly, their piety. The horse was presented as a sacred gift to Athena. To destroy it or refuse to welcome it meant incurring the wrath of the powerful goddess, who, as they might think, had finally turned her back on the Greeks. Secondly, their weariness. 10 years of war had exhausted everyone. The sight of the empty Greek camp and the ships sailing away was so desirable that they wanted to believe in it, contrary to all logic. Thirdly, because of their pride. Accepting the horse into the city meant not just accepting a gift, but bringing into Troy a symbol of their victory, a trophy testifying to the enemy's shameful flight. The prophetess Cassandra and the priest Laocoon begged their fellow citizens not to bring the wooden monster into the city. "Beware of the Danaans bearing gifts," cried Laocoon, throwing a spear at the horse's side, and a dull groan of metal was heard from inside. But the gods, who were on the side of the Achaeans, had already made their move. 2 giant snakes crawled out of the sea and, in full view of the whole city, strangled Laocoon and his sons. For the Trojans, this was the final, terrifying sign. Laocoon had been punished by the gods for his sacrilege. There was no longer any doubt. They dismantled part of the wall because the giant horse could not fit through the gate, a symbolic act showing how they themselves were destroying their defenses. With songs and jubilation, they dragged their doom into the very heart of the city. All night long, Troy celebrated. Wine flowed freely, people danced in the streets, confident that the nightmare was over. Ares, with all his fury and power, could not have devised a more cruel irony. His methods were powerless against the high walls. Athena, however, found a way to make the Trojans open the gates themselves, destroy the walls themselves, and celebrate their own destruction themselves. Under cover of night, when the city was fast asleep, Odysseus and his warriors emerged from the belly of the horse. They killed the guards, opened the city gates, and signaled to the fleet, which was already returning under cover of darkness. What followed was no longer a battle, it was a massacre. Sleepy, unarmed, intoxicated with victory, the city was doomed. The fury of the Achaeans, pent up for 10 years, spilled out onto the streets of Troy. In this final act of tragedy, Athena's strategy and the fury so beloved of Ares merged together. But this fury was only made possible by cold and precise calculation. Athens did not simply win. It proved that intelligence is the greatest multiplier of power, capable of channeling destructive energy in the right direction and crushing any barrier, even the most solid one. It is important to understand that the Olympians were not omnipotent puppeteers in the modern sense. Their power, though it seemed limitless to mortals, had its limits. Above them all, even above Zeus himself, loomed a faceless and inexorable force, Moira, fate. The gods could influence the course of events, accelerate or delay what was predestined, but they were powerless to cancel it. The destruction of Troy was a foregone conclusion, and the divine confrontation was not about whether it would happen, but how it would happen. Ares, in his straightforwardness, sought total destruction in open battle, victory through superiority in strength and fury. Athena, on the other hand, worked on a scenario in which the fall of the city would not be just a military defeat, but a triumph of the Greek spirit and a humiliating collapse of Trojan pride. She did not fight fate, she wrote its most sophisticated and cruel paragraph. Interestingly, the Greeks themselves had a deeply ambivalent attitude towards Ares. Unlike the Romans, who elevated his counterpart Mars to the rank of one of the most important father gods, defender of the state and order, the Greeks openly disliked and feared Ares. He came from wild, barbaric Thrace, and they saw in him not the valor of a defender, but a blind, destructive passion for killing. The Greeks, the creators of philosophy and democracy, valued war as a necessity, but despised it as an end in itself. Ares was the embodiment of the side of war that they hated in themselves: animal instinct, panic, bloody frenzy. Athena, on the other hand, personified just war, war as a continuation of politics, as an instrument for establishing order. Therefore, their conflict at Troy was also an internal conflict within Greek civilization itself, which was struggling with its own barbaric origins. Athena's cruelty, however, was no less terrible than Ares' fury, only it was cold and calculating. The most tragic example of this was the fate of Ajax the Great, Telamon's son. After Achilles' death, it was Ajax, the second strongest warrior in the Achaean camp, who carried his body from the battlefield under a hail of Trojan spears. He rightly believed that the fallen hero's armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, should go to him. But the armor was awarded to Odysseus, not for his strength, but for his cunning. The decision was made with the active support of Athena, Odysseus' patroness. For Ajax, a warrior of honor and brute strength, this was an unbearable humiliation. His mind clouded with rage, and at night he decided to slaughter all the Achaean leaders who had awarded the victory to his rival. And here Athena intervened again. But she did not calm the hero or reason with him. Instead, she sent madness upon him. She did not save the leaders. She made Ajax's revenge pitiful and shameful. In his fog of madness, Ajax saw the Achaean leaders in a herd of sheep and oxen. He rushed at the defenseless animals, cutting them to pieces with his sword. He dragged the chief ram, in which he saw Odysseus, into his tent, tied it to a post, and tortured it with a whip for a long time, shouting curses. When the bloody fog cleared in the morning, and Ajax saw what he had done, the shame was worse than death for him. He could not bear the thought of what the goddess of wisdom had turned him into. Taking the sword that Hector had once given him, he threw himself on it and died. Athena did not simply eliminate the threat to her favorites. She demonstratively destroyed the hero who embodied principles close to Ares, direct strength and military honor, unburdened by cunning. In this war, it is not the strongest who will win, but the smartest and most ruthless. Mortals on the battlefield felt this divine intervention as a terrible, irrational force that changed the rules of the game without warning. In the fourth song of the Iliad, the sides, exhausted by fighting, conclude a truce. Menelaus and Paris must decide the outcome in a duel. Paris loses, and it seems that the war is about to end. But Hera and Athena, who wanted the complete destruction of Troy, could not allow this to happen. Athena descends from Olympus in the guise of a Trojan warrior and finds the archer Pandarus. She tempts him, promising him great glory if he dares to shoot Menelaus. "Imagine," she whispers, "what gratitude and what gifts you will receive from Paris if he sees his rival struck down by your arrow." Pandarus, succumbing to temptation, draws his huge bow made of mountain goat horns and releases the arrow. Athena, however, immediately appears beside Menelaus and prevents the arrow from inflicting a fatal wound. She deflects it so that it only scratches the skin, but blood is shed. The goal is achieved. The truce is broken in the most treacherous manner. The Trojans are declared perjurers. The war flares up with renewed, even greater fury, claiming thousands of lives. For the goddess, this was just one move in her long-standing game. For mortals, it was the collapse of hope, a betrayal that plunged them into a new cycle of senseless slaughter. They were not players, but pawns who could be sacrificed at any moment for a higher purpose they did not understand. Even the triumphant capture of Troy did not mark the end of the divine confrontation. The victory, achieved through cunning, gave rise to chaos that proved no less destructive than that sown by Ares. In the heat of victory, the Achaeans committed many sacrileges. The most terrible of these was the deed of Ajax the Lesser, Oiledes. Pursuing the Trojan princess and prophetess Cassandra, he caught up with her in the temple of Athena. In despair, the girl embraced the statue of her patron goddess, seeking protection. But this did not stop the warrior. He forcibly dragged Cassandra away from the statue, thereby committing a terrible sacrilege before the very eyes of the goddess herself. Athena's wrath was terrible. Her strategic goal, the destruction of Troy, had been achieved, and now her pragmatism gave way to her wounded pride. She, who had helped the Achaeans for 10 years, now turned all her power against them. She turned to Poseidon, god of the seas, who, although he was on the side of the Greeks, harbored a grudge against Odysseus for blinding his son Polyphemus. Their past differences were forgotten in the face of a common goal: revenge. When the Greek fleet set sail for home, laden with booty, Athena and Poseidon unleashed terrible storms upon it. Lightning bolts sent by Zeus at his daughter's request split the ships, and giant waves engulfed them along with their crews. Most of the Achaean ships and heroes who had survived 10 years of war met their doom at sea on their way home. Victory turned into disaster. Athena, the goddess of order, herself created chaos, showing that her wisdom and wrath were two sides of the same coin. Her final move in this war showed that the difference between her and Ares was perhaps only in their methods, but not in their ultimate destructive power. Thus, the confrontation between Athena and Ares went far beyond a simple dispute over tactics. It was a fundamental dispute about the very nature of power and victory. Is power the result of overwhelming force that suppresses the will of the enemy? Or is it the product of a sophisticated mind that forces the enemy to dig their own grave? The Trojan War, as interpreted by Homer, gives a clear answer in favor of the latter. But the tragic fate of the victors, their painful return home, full of loss and suffering, leaves a bitter aftertaste. It suggests that even the most brilliant strategic victory, achieved through deception and cruelty, carries within it the seeds of future chaos. Athena outplayed Ares and decided the outcome of the war, but the fire she helped ignite ultimately burned her own chosen ones. The great battle of wits and strength was over, but peace and order never came. This divine duel pitted not just two different approaches against each other, but two fundamental concepts of the Greek worldview: Bia and Metis. Bia is a crude, unformed force, violence as such, embodied by Ares. Metis, on the other hand, is a quality that is much more complex and valued by the Greeks. It is not just intelligence, it is cunning, practical sense, the ability to find unconventional solutions, to see opportunities where others see only obstacles. Athena was the goddess of Metis, and the entire Trojan War became a vivid demonstration of how Metis subjugates and directs Bia. Ares could win 100 skirmishes, but Athena played the game on a completely different level. She won the war. Her strategy was remarkably economical. While Ares wasted his divine energy by personally rushing into the thick of battle and risking humiliating wounds, Athena acted as a catalyst. She did not create power out of nothing, she multiplied the existing potential of her heroes. One piece of sound advice given to Odysseus, one spark of courage ignited in Diomedes' heart, one vision sent to Achilles, and these pinpoint interventions led to cascading consequences that changed the balance of power across the entire battlefield. The Trojan horse is the apotheosis of this economy. It did not require a single lightning strike to create it, only a deep understanding of the enemy's psychology. Athena made the Trojans not afraid, she made them make mistakes. Fear passes, while a fatal mistake is irreversible. Moreover, her strategic planning began long before the first battle. According to some myths, it was Athena who taught the Argonaut Argos the art of shipbuilding, which made it possible to create the Argo. Later, this knowledge helped the Danaans build a fleet of 1,000 ships, on which they arrived at the walls of Troy. It turns out that the goddess of wisdom was at the very origins of the campaign, creating the very instrument that brought war to the doorstep of her enemies. She did not simply join the conflict, she made it possible on a technical level, which Ares, with his love of primitive hand-to-hand combat, would simply not have been able to do. This difference in approach was reflected in the fate of their mortal protégés. Ares supported Hector, the greatest hero of Troy. He gave him fury in battle and helped him to oppress the Achaeans. But at the decisive moment, when fate demanded its due, Eris was powerless. His patronage was bright but short-lived, like the flame of a bonfire. Athena, on the other hand, led her favorite Odysseus down a completely different path. She did not always give him victory in battle, but she always gave him the means to survive. She taught him patience, cunning, the ability to disguise himself as a beggar and endure humiliation for the sake of the ultimate goal. Hector died a hero, remaining a symbol of valor. Odysseus survived, returned home, and restored order. Athena played the long game, and her bet was not on a glorious death, but on a difficult but meaningful life. The confrontation was complicated by the position of other gods. On the side of Troy was Apollo, the god of light, harmony, and reason. It would seem that he should have been an ally of Athena. But Apollo was not just defending the Trojans, he was defending their culture, their order, their civilization from complete destruction. For him, the war waged by Athena was excessively cruel, its logic destructive. He saw that behind the goddess's strategic effectiveness lay a cold ruthlessness that left no room for mercy or the preservation of beauty. Thus it was not just intellect and strength that clashed on the fields of Ilion, but two different types of mind. The pragmatic and ruthless intellect of Athena against the mind of Apollo, striving for harmony and preservation. This added another dimension to the tragedy, showing that even the gods of reason could not agree on which order to consider true. The myth of the Trojan War reminds us that intellect and strategy often surpass pure power. Athena, using cunning, not only outmaneuvered Ares, but also determined the outcome of the conflict, leaving us with an eternal lesson about the value of the mind in any confrontation. This story continues to inspire, showing that even in the fiercest battles, the one who thinks ahead wins.